Thank you very much for that introduction, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for everybody who made this possible. This is a really great turnout. I do want to just recognize two people, Dr. Clovis Maksoud, who is everybody's wise counselor, I guess, would we call, and Albert Mokiver, who brought and all the people who brought all these people during the day to their various seminars and workshops with the leadership of Ambassador Salah Sarhan. Thank you. Well, I wouldn't be invited here if it wasn't an invitation for candor. So here we go. I don't speak for Arab Americans, but I think I speak for some Arab Americans who would want our country to be a humanitarian superpower. We've been a military superpower. It hasn't worked out very well. Starting after 9/11, with a gang in northeast Afghanistan, they are now all over 20 countries, destabilizing, destroying, and challenging the hegemony of the West. They have long memories, and it's not just their memories. The people of the Middle East and the Islamic world remember all the way back to the Crusades as a harbinger of what was to come for the last 110 years, as Western powers, taking advantage of World War I, carved up the Middle East and supported people who wanted to concentrate power over their own people, with fairly negative effects, to put it mildly. This was all in the image of President Woodrow Wilson. The war to end all wars, remember that phrase? The war to save democracy around the world. What do I mean by humanitarian superpower? It means extending the best of our country with the consent of those overseas, and healthcare, and land reclamation, and agrarian cooperatives, and new ways of transporting people, new ways of building homes. It's not that we have a monopoly on that knowledge, but we've done it ourselves in our country, and it's worked out pretty well in many of these areas. And so a helping hand is important. But it's only important when we recognize third world genius, to put it simply. We recognize that the microcredit movement started with Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. When the building for impoverished Egyptian peasants, elegant small homes made from the dirt under their feet. That was an Egyptian architect, the people's architect, he was called. And he has many supporters around the world in that manner. Or teaching illiterate Brazilian peasants in a remarkably quick period how to read and write. That's Paulo Freire from Brazil. And he has followers around the world. And there are thousands of examples. We don't highlight them enough. And the receptivity to our being a humanitarian superpower would certainly be much greater if we recognize that. What we have seen in the last few years, of course, is the criminal, unconstitutional invasion of Iraq by the Bush-Cheney Corps. This was sociocide at its most intensity, sociocide. It led to the death of well over 1 million Iraqis. They don't even have the dignity of being counted. They're undercounted. Just as the number of US soldiers injured in Iraq were undercounted, officially. Millions of refugees, Iraqi refugees, Iraqis who helped the US soldiers could never get into this country after they were threatened as refugees or seeking asylum. And what did it bring us? David Halberstam, the great reporter, once was asked about Iraq. He said, it's like slamming a beehive. What did it bring us? And yet, we hardly have much contrition. We hardly have much regret, which is a way to learn from history. It's just remarkable. It was an unconstitutional move. It was never declared by the Congress. It violated the Geneva Conventions, the invasion of Iraq. It violated federal statutes. And it proved once again that when you inhabit the White House and it comes to foreign and military policy, you are above the law. The law cannot reach you. We're supposed to be a rule of law country. We're supposed to be a beacon to the world. What is left of international law when presidents of all parties can declare that there's no place in the world that's off limit to our direct attacks, violating national sovereignties, violating all kinds of international laws, treaties, Geneva Conventions that we belong to and that we helped draft, the UN Charter, which has the effect of federal law. We were a chief architect. Why is it that we self-censor ourselves? Why is it that I talk to so many officials in the government and they whisper when they want to tell me the truth? Why do we not protect them to speak out? If they can't take their conscience to work, then the rascals are going to prevail. And I see that in the Foreign Service. I see that in the militarization of the State Department. I see that in muzzling Pentagon whistleblowers. I even see it in formal opposition inside the Pentagon to the Iraq War, up to 4-star generals. They were muzzled by the civilian leadership from the White House to the Pentagon. And what this does is it ignores the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the 2002 peace initiative by the Arab League, or the League of Arab States, representing over 30 Arab and Islamic countries. That was put forth with great visibility, and it was disregarded, treated almost with contemptuous indifference by the Israeli government, and not treated very seriously by the US government. This peace offer for negotiations, it wasn't an ultimatum, was basically to respect UN resolutions 242 and others and return to the 67 boundaries, a two-state solution, a kind of proposal that actually would have the support of half of the Israeli population. And also former Israeli security people have come out and said this is a good starting point. Why aren't we doing it? I remember seeing full-page ads in the New York Times describing the Arab League petition or peace offering. And in return, to be full diplomatic relations and economic relations and everything else in that area. I think this is a failure of the U.S. diplomatic initiative, not to take that more seriously and arrange for negotiations. It was even tweaked in recent years to say, well, there might be adjustments in terms of territorial adjustments, modifying the 67 borders, and there might be some consideration for refugees and repatriation. The problem is that most people in this country have no influence over foreign and military policy, our democratic pretensions notwithstanding. Whether they have any interest is another matter. But if they try to have an interest, the centralization of power and the militarization of foreign policy continues to get worse no matter who's in power in the executive branch or in Congress. And what it does is it dehumanizes us. And the dehumanization is reflected in the way we're treating refugees. After the Vietnam War, we allowed the entry of 160,000 Vietnamese, who have risen to all kinds of achievements and performances. After the Iraq war and years of struggle, there's a fraction of Iraqis who would like to seek asylum or who should have refugee status under our laws. I believe Sweden has accepted more Iraqis than the United States. There are U.S. soldiers who have now devoted their entire life to try to bring in Iraqi refugees, who worked with them, who protected them, who drove them, who interpreted for them, who advised them, but are now in very perilous state. And when we get dehumanized, and we're a country that received refugees for decades, in fact, we're almost a nation of people escaping deprivation, oppression, discrimination, bigotry. And we have reached a point in 2015 when we can look at 2.5 million Syrian refugees, and I believe we've only accepted less than 50. This is, as some political figures in Michigan said, we should accept Syrian refugees in Michigan simply as an instrument of economic development, quite apart from humanitarian. In Detroit and Dearborn. It's almost tempting to ask, would this kind of animosity to the most innocent and vulnerable people fleeing terror, fleeing starvation, fleeing bombing, fleeing sectarian conflict, of which we're not immune from being charged with having some causal role. Would this kind of attitude have been conveyed to any other ethnic group other than Arabs? If they were Jewish refugees? If they're European refugees? If they're East Asian refugees? We have a program called Debating Taboos. You can go see it, called debatingtaboos.org. One of the taboos that's never discussed in this country is anti-Semitism against Arabs. We know there's been anti-Semitism against Jews, but anti-Semitism against Arabs is almost open season. And it's not just in this country, it's in other parts of the world. The most coarse, brutal language you can imagine has come out of Israel against the Arabs. They talk about the Palestinians' incitement. Look at the record. Hollywood is constantly stereotyping and disparaging in the cruelest ways Arabs. This would not be allowed against any other ethnic group. And I think it's the responsibility of Arab Americans to point this out. As ADC has pointed out, as the Task Force on Lebanon has pointed out, and other groups, but not enough has been made of it. It spills over in terms of blocking a reasonable number of refugees from these war-torn countries. Third, I'd like to point out that too much of the news from the Middle East is on conflict. There's another world there, as you all know. It goes on daily. It's a world of productivity, of kindness, of culture, of art, of proverbs, of neighborhood, of community, of lineage, of kinship, a great culinary tradition. Most people in this country never hear about it, never see about it, never read about it. This is the problem of bad news crowding out good news. I think Arab Americans have got a lot to offer in this, and we just heard how valuable ethnic groups are in this country in terms of giving valuable insights about their home country, their mother country. I think Arab Americans have a good opportunity to do much in this respect. Salwa Nashashibi brought the first Arab women's art tour to this country. Wasn't very widely publicized in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it drew a lot of people as it toured the country. And we have other cultural activities reported in Middle East Report, music, but not enough. Arab culture is a lot of fun. It's got a whimsy, it's got a depth, it's got a history, it's got a uniqueness that's, I think, very attractive to the American people. It's not just hummus. And I think we should make more of it because culture is extremely important in humanizing the people who exchange it and learn about it and enjoy it. As a family, we've tried to do our part. We did a book called 17 Traditions, How My Parents Raised Their 4 Children. And it's the only book I've ever written that everybody loves. And just to give you one example, when we misbehaved as children, as all children do, normally parents would say, "Stop it, you'll be sorry, don't do it again." Well, my parents disciplined us with Arabic proverbs. كل شيء زاد نقص. كتور يكديش يطلع الحشيش. How can you shrug off Proverbs, right? You just can't shrug off Proverbs. They're too deep. They're too tested throughout history. My sister Claire, Dr. Claire Nader, she arranged for an early conference in Beirut on economic development in the Middle East with the physicist Tony Zahlan. That was back in the 60s. Late 60s, which was put out in a book form, groundbreaking conference. My sister Laura, who's an anthropologist at Berkeley for over 50 years, has just put out a book called What the Rest Think of the West, from 600 AD to 2015. Original material on people from Egypt and Persia and India and Japan and China with remarkable insights into the West's state of affairs, sort of turning it around. It's not just our observations of the East. I think the culture thing can hardly be overemphasized. It pervades everything. And if people don't have their own culture, they become imitative of other cultures. You see that in China. China, you know, the symbol, the pictograph in China is Middle Kingdom. And it was the center of the world in their minds centuries ago. And now it's increasingly a mimic culture, mimicking the West. There's some efforts in China to turn that around. Well, my parents came from Lebanon that perfected mimicking the West. I remember being in Lebanon many, many years ago, going to an orchard, and the farmer was spraying pesticides everywhere, on his hands, on the grapes, on the figs, on the animals, domesticated animals. And I would say, "What are you doing? Don't you know about these pesticides?" And he says to me, "Malaish, mamulin biswisra." It's okay, it's made in Switzerland. So it's okay, you know, it's made in Switzerland. I had so many experiences. I once went to a little cafe near the big grotto in Lebanon, and I said to the waiter, "Atini sab'a kafeye, atini sab'a lafao." And he said, "Sab'a lafao? What's that?" And I said, "Well, go ask your maitre d'." So the maitre d' came, and I said, "I want the drink, sab'a lafao." He said, "Oh, you mean 7-Up?" So it just goes on and on. Now, there is something, and I'm sure you've experienced this, there is something with a fragile culture that's been weakened for a whole variety of reasons, so that people don't have self-confidence in their own culture. They don't like to speak Arabic, or they'd rather speak French. Bonne nuit, bonjour. And pretty soon they're not learning Arabic. And pretty soon, when you don't learn a language with that kind of historical depth, you forget more than just the words and phrases, don't you? You forget everything attached to it, including its wisdom. So I hope that we'll do more of this and try to, if it's ever at all possible, rise above the contemporary news in order to lay a foundation that brings the best out of people. One of the key questions you want to ask about any political leader, does that leader bring the best out of people? I don't think that's a characterization of the current crop of Republican candidates, I might add. And I don't think it characterizes any candidate who is a militarist and a corporatist. And that's why, ending on this note, I think we need more exchanges between people in our country and people in the Middle East and the Islamic world on issues of consumer protection, health, safety, economic well-being. They import a lot of goods from the West that are very deceptively labeled. They're often contaminated, whether they're pharmaceuticals or foodstuffs. I was invited years ago to go to Saudi Arabia by a very fine corporate lawyer, Salah Hajlan, to talk about these things because they were really losing people, their lives and health and safety to junk exports. It was a dumping ground for products that couldn't be sold in Europe and other Western countries. I think we also ought to have exchanges on labor. One of the most depressing aspects of rich countries in the Middle East is the treatment of foreign labor. Inexcusable. It's not only inexcusable from a moral point of view, it's inexcusable from a security point of view. When you see the disparity in numbers of imported labor compared to people who live there. And it's time to build a level of consumer protection and labor rights that are homegrown, rooted in the best Islamic traditions. And you can find a lot of Islamic traditions to weave around those protections. It is not heartening to see very young children in the Arab world where there is a high per capita income to become so obese because they're eating Western junk food. And one of the benefits of consumer protection in the Middle East is to save and forever implant the Mediterranean diet, which the leading nutritionists of the world now say is the #1 most healthful diet in the entire world. This is not just recollection or folklore. This is nutritional science. And to see high-fat, high-salt, high-sweet diets, high-sugar diets pouring in from McDonald-type funnels from the West to the Middle East is the antithesis of healthy living. On that point, I thank you very much for your invitation.